Today's lecture is on what we call the pre-monarchial period. It covers the period of Judges. It includes the books of Joshua through to 1 Samuel. Some scholars would remove Ruth from this period, and also we would say that Saul began the monarchy really, but in a way he was just a stepping stone, and the real monarchy begins with David and the reaffirmation of the covenant for David. Ruth is removed from this period partly because the book of Ruth is in the writings, and so some scholars think that is later, even though the events in the book of Ruth happened during the days of the Judges. So we will consider Ruth when we look at the writings. So the revelation of God in this period. First of all, God spoke, for example, to Samuel when he was a child. So there's a continuation of person-to-person communication. Secondly, the Spirit of God moved upon individuals. For example, the judges are mostly described as being moved by the Spirit, or possibly clothed with the Spirit, or there's a variety of terms that are used. Many writers would call the judges, charismatic leaders. Thirdly, miracles took place. Well, there's the crossing of the Jordan River, obviously, as the whole nation of Israel crosses on dry ground and the river is stopped flowing. Angels appear to men. An angel spoke to Manoah and his wife about the birth of Samson. There were priestly oracles that were given primarily to Samuel, and prophecies, which are a little different from the priestly oracles. But note particularly these are during this period, Samuel seems to be the greatest representative of the prophetic movement. There's a very significant introduction in this period is the school of the sons of the prophets, which initiated by Samuel. And it seems like the prophets were becoming more organized and recognized as a group. Samuel, of course, was known for his prophetic ministry. And then finally, we have that God communicates through blessings and cursings, or punishment, which occurred among the people. The different enemies during the Judges were sent to make the people aware of their sin and turn them back to God for forgiveness. So the content of the message, the actual revelations. First of all, there were communications through judges teaching God's requirements so that they would understand how to live in the land if they wanted to stay in the land. Secondly, there was confirmation through blessing, which resulted from obedience, or punishment, which resulted from sin. Thirdly, we notice in this period of time that the promise is centered on the land. The emphasis is now on possession of the land. Emphasis was no longer so much on the seed. Some scholars classify Deuteronomy through 1 Kings as the product of the Deuteronomic historian. The reason is the emphasis on the land, but actually that's not really sufficient reason. Naturally, when Joshua takes over, the matters in Deuteronomy will be continued, but there are issues in Judges that don't come up in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy promises a monarchy, but the Judges don't satisfy this. The elements of faith and obedience naturally continue in this period. In the Hebrew Bible, Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings are books of the former prophets. Thus, these books in the tradition of Israel are an outgrowth of the ministry of Moses. They're seen as prophetic books, not just historical. 1 and 2 Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, are not considered prophetic. They are classified in the writings. The land is the place that Yahweh has chosen to put his name. The land is the inheritance of Israel. It is the land of rest. It's pictured this way in comparison to the struggles of the wilderness wanderings, not in comparison to later events. Notice that they had to fight to actually possess the land, so it's not a land of total rest. Okay. Walter Kaiser identifies 3 passages that build a bridge between the days of Moses, the time of the Judges, and the monarchy. In the Mosaic era, we have Deuteronomy 31 to 34, where Moses prepares to leave and Joshua is anointed. And in Joshua 1 and 12, the leadership of Joshua is established It is a reminder to keep the law, and it emphasises possession of the land by battle, except, of course, for the Gibeonites. The people of God will experience battles in order to take possession of the land. Then Joshua's chapters 23 and 24 is a kind of linking scripture. Joshua is departing, and the issue is serve God. Living in the land and receiving God's blessing requires service to God. Also Judges chapter 2, verses 11 to 23. And the people's refusal to serve the Lord, the arrival of King Saul, who begins to lead Israel. And then the final link is in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where we have the Davidic covenant stated, where God promises to do wonderful things through David and through his family. And so we see in that period the promise of a Messiah. We see kings, prophets and priests, the completion of the temple, and so on, after David, actually. So after the Davidic era, time extends to the latter days. Jesus appears as the Messiah and enters Jerusalem as king, ministers the people as priest, confronts the Pharisees, the Sadducees and Herodians as a prophet. So let's look in a little more detail at some of the judges. The first thing to note is that the book of Judges is highly unlikely to be chronological. The emphasis in Judges is on what happens when people don't keep the covenant requirements. So we look at Deborah and Gideon and Samson, and how can we see them in the light of the covenant? Actually, in the book of Judges, there's only one real reference to the covenant, and that's in chapter 2. God sends a messenger to state that God is a covenant-keeping God, and because of that, he has set some requirements. Judges 17 to 19 and chapter 21, the repeated theme there is no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So these final chapters of Judges prepare the way for the events of 1 Samuel, because in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth does not intervene between these two books. The author of Judges, of course, is not saying there was no human king. He's saying that the Israelites did not recognize God as king. Okay. So the events in the early chapters, we notice first of all that the people did not do together. They could not do so individually what they did together. The individual tribes did not succeed in conquest the way the united force had. For example, the tribe of Judah was unable to conquer all of their territory. The chariots were faster and better equipped on level ground. Throughout chapter 1 of Judges, the impression is created that Israel actually liked having servants. In chapter 1, verse 33 and verse 35, it seems like they, instead of destroying the people, they made them their servants. But the whole point was that Israelites were supposed to be servants. Servants of the Lord cannot lord it over others. They were supposed to destroy the people and take the land. And the question of who is in charge is important. If God is in charge, the people are totally dependent on and should be obedient to him. So Israel was supposed to be totally in possession of the land. God was with them and no one could stand before them. The only battle lost was the Battle of Ai, where God fulfilled all his promises, as Joshua says at the end of the book. And the reason why they lost the battle at Ai, of course, was because of the sin of Achan. There was sin in the camp. So the focal point for what should be happening in this period is Judges chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. It stresses the way the people should have been behaving, but shows their disobedience. So the whole idea is that God is proving or testing Israel to show them what their problem is. God already knew them, of course, but he wanted to show them their own weakness, and their weakness actually is their stubbornness, the very thing they thought of as their strength. Their stubbornness meant they thought they could do things their own way. They broke the commandment and therefore broke the covenant. They were supposed to learn what results when you don't trust God. Chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 seems to be teaching that each generation is going to have to learn the importance of keeping covenant, and they'll have to learn it by warfare. We should learn from the experience of our elders, but our own stubbornness often means we have to learn by our own struggles. They were supposed to learn from the celebration of the feast what the previous generation had learned, but they let the feast become rituals. Every male in Israel bears in his own body the sign of the covenant, circumcision, which should have reminded them to keep that covenant. So let's have a look at Deborah in Judges chapter 5. This is the poetic version of the story. She praises Barak and the princes who helped in verse 9, and Jael in verse 24. But she also makes some serious comment on Israel's condition. Why didn't Reuben come to fight the battle? Apparently sheep were more important to Reuben than covenant relationship and loyalty to God's people. It appears that because the trouble was not in his territory, Reuben didn't feel the need to be involved. But the fact of the covenant relationship meant they were involved and should have been there. Verse 17 speaks about Gilead. This would have been the half-tribe of Manasseh who stayed in Transjordan and didn't come and help either, even though the trouble was kind of close to them. Dan stayed on the Sea of Galilee and didn't get involved. That's a lack of understanding of covenant relationship. And also in verse 17, Asher stayed on the coast. He enjoyed the resorts of the sea coast. The refrain is there was no king in Israel. They just chose not to be involved, but as members of the covenant people, they were involved, and by refusing to come, they broke covenant. What seems to be at issue is the uncaring attitude and the negative response to the question of Cain, am I my brother's keeper? The whole of Scripture actually answers that question with a resounding yes, but apparently Reuben, Dan, Manasseh, and Asher didn't feel that responsibility. When we come to Gideon, this is a very interesting passage. In Judges chapter 6, verse 15, Gideon says, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh and I am the least in my family. Okay. It seems to indicate that Gideon at least was a humble person and he didn't see himself as being important enough to lead Israel. This is something that Saul states too, and again it's kind of it echoes the attitude of David, but Zechariah tells us we should not despise the day of small beginnings, and so maybe this foreshadows the importance of humility in God's choice of men to lead his covenant people. So God teaches Gideon that Yahweh is a covenant-keeping God. In verse 17 of chapter 6, he asks for a sign, and from 36 to 40 we have the fleece incident. He apparently had not had enough personal experience in relationship to God to have faith. The fleece is not a symbol of faith, but it's a symbol of a lack of faith, and he asks twice for God to prove himself through the fleece. But he still has a problem with faith in chapter 7. God says, if you're afraid, go down to the Midianite camp. And he does actually go down to the Midianite camp, which tells us he was afraid. The Midianites apparently knew about Gideon, and there's not really any way for us to explain how they knew about Gideon. Also, of course, the miraculous deliverance from the Midianites, because there's no way that 300 Israelites could put the whole Midianite army to flight. So it's God's work, really, alone. Gideon had a great time of testing. I mean, he called to all Israel to come to the battle. 30,000 came. And then he was told to send home anybody who was afraid. And 20,000 of them went home. So that's probably a bit discouraging. And then, of course, he's told he's still got too many and they're weeded out and he's left with only 300. So that the glory for the defeat of the Midianites doesn't go to Gideon and his army, it goes to God, because what happened was clearly an impossibility. After this great deliverance, however, the Israelites want to make Gideon king. They're trying to establish a dynasty. And doing this, they were really taking the prerogative of gods. Gideon's response is a recognition that Yahweh is the only king Israel should have. But then he makes this request and produces an ephod, and the whole of Israel becomes fascinated by it, more fascinated, in fact, than they are by the presence of God in the tabernacle. So Gideon seems to be either accepting or perhaps even aiming at priesthood. The king was to come from Judah and the priesthood from Levi, but Gideon came from Manasseh, and he seems to have forgotten what he had learned from God, and he forgot that the important thing was God's presence in the midst of his people. He also put aside covenant responsibility in preference to personal desire. By producing an ephod, he seems to have been trying to take the place of the priesthood, which was forbidden. However, the consequences were only reaped by his descendants. Then we come to Samson in Judges chapter 13. We need to spend a bit of time on this because Samson is a very contradictory figure. He was a product of a miraculous birth, which is the opposite to his predecessor, Jephthah. We might talk a little more about Jephthah after this, but Jephthah was the son of a concubine, and he was driven away from his brothers who were legitimate sons. The story of the sacrifice that is made, the appearance of the angel and the barrenness of Samson's mother remind us of the birth of Isaac, and then of course are echoed again in John the Baptist. Jephthah was considered no good and he was driven out of the land, but he became good and came back to lead Israel. After Jephthah, we have Samson, who had a calling and a purpose, both of which were missing in Jephthah's story. But Samson does not accomplish what Jephthah did. Jephthah brought deliverance. Samson won victories, but not deliverance. So there are clear covenant implications in the story of the birth of Samson. The coming of the Spirit on Samson is mentioned 4 times in chapter 13, verse 25, 14, verse 6, and 19, and 15, verse 14. Every time except the first, the Spirit comes upon him, it is for his own personal goals. Deliverance from the Philistines was never accomplished until David slew Goliath. The lesson is that a victory does not necessarily result in deliverance. We should not use victories for personal achievement, but for the deliverance of God, of God's people. The covenant relationship showed there was to be a separation, but Samson paid no attention to it. He gave no respect to the covenant. It was not a matter of ignorance, it was a matter of choice. Even at the end of his life, he prayed this marvelous prayer, but it was still only for personal reasons. It was not because of the struggles of the Israelites who were oppressed by the Philistines. It was because the Philistines had put out his eyes and he wanted vengeance. Covenant relationship demands that there be no other gods. We can get so caught up with our own success that we become our own God. The issue is not in the presence and practice of covenant, but in the absence of such practice. Samson, often people kind of suggest that he was deceived by Delilah. But if you read the passage carefully, you will see that she didn't deceive him at all. She told him exactly what she was going to do. And she asked how he could be bound so that the Philistines could capture him and he would be like any other man. And even though he told lies, she tried everything he told her so that he had a warning that she was going to do what she said she was going to do. He wasn't deceived by Delilah, he was deceived by himself. And one of the saddest verses in Scripture is in this passage on Samson in Judges chapter 16. Verse 20, then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. What a tragedy. How could a man so anointed by God, used by the Spirit, not know that the Lord had left him? He deceived himself. Even though he knew he had told her the truth and that she would actually do it, he didn't believe that his strength came from the Lord, I guess, or he didn't believe that his strength was related to his Nazirite vow, which he'd broken on several occasions before his hair was cut off. I just want to go back to Jephthah for a moment. Jephthah makes a vow, which is a pretty foolish vow, actually, but he seems to be quite a godly man. And he makes this vow. It's publicly. Okay. Jephthah has only one child. It's a girl. And actually being the only child, she would inherit her father's property when he died. His vow, he promises, he says, whatever comes out of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. That's how it's translated in English. However, the word that's used there for sacrifice could mean just devoted to the Lord, in which case, if it were an animal, for example, it wouldn't be used for any work. It would just be it would belong to the Lord and it wouldn't have to do any work. And in the case of, say, his daughter, she would be devoted to the Lord and not have to marry. Now, of course, when he comes home triumphantly, she is the first one to come out the house. She must have known about his vow. There's a different way of looking at this than the normal way. There's one commentator who's looked at this way. Firstly, it seems like maybe she thought that she could persuade her father to break the vow because she's the only child. Okay, but he says, he's promised to the Lord, and so she says, okay, do what you've promised. But then she asked, give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends because I will never marry. Okay, so what seems to be happening here is roaming the hills seems to be a suggestion that she was going to the high places with her friends and maybe seeking other gods. Maybe she isn't the kind of believer that her father is. Okay, and so to no avail, of course, she seeks the help of other gods. She returns, and then it says he did for her what he had vowed. It also says that she is going to weep because she would never marry, that the weeping would be about her virginity, that she would be a perpetual virgin. And so all of this together seems to suggest that he didn't actually kill her, that she was devoted to the Lord, that she therefore would not marry, and that she would inherit his property when he died. Given the tenor of all of the rest of the scripture regarding human sacrifice, it's really impossible to believe that he made a human sacrifice here and that God accepted it, because even when God tested Abraham and told him to sacrifice Isaac, he didn't permit him. Everywhere else it's mentioned in scripture, it's an abomination to God. So I think we have to accept that Jephthah did not actually kill his daughter, that he devoted her to the Lord for the rest of her life. She therefore did not marry, and that at the end of his life she inherited his property, but she would have been childless. So I guess in the end her property would go to some other member of his clan.